there's the topic for tonight, the principles of Buddhist science of the mind. But before I even turn to the next slide, I'd like to make a disclaimer. And that is, first of all, there are some, I think, enthusiasts who would want to say that Buddhism itself is a science of the mind. And I think that's simply a mistake. What we're doing that when we make such a statement, for those who do it, is taking a Western construct, the Western notion of science as we have devised it out of our Mediterranean culture, the European culture, the Euro-American culture, the global culture, taking this construct, which really is uniquely Western, and then superimposing that on an absolutely external discipline of inquiry, of spiritual transformation, and so forth, which probably is illegitimate from the start. So is Buddhism a science? No. But in the same breath that I would say Buddhism itself is not simply a science, I would equally, and with equal enthusiasm, say Buddhism is not simply a religion. When academics try to study Buddhism, they've got to put it in one of their familiar boxes. It would be very arduous for them to say, we're now going to study something outside of Western civilization. Let's start an entirely new discipline, a whole new department, because we have an odd bird here, because it's not simply philosophy, it's not simply a science, it's not simply a religion, and it's not simply anything else. So, gee, what does it most look like? There are a lot of monks out there and incense in temples, they must be religious. And so we plunk it into the nearest box, and then it gets categorized there, but which means in most philosophy departments in the country, it's ignored entirely. And you can have professional philosophers who are enormously erudite from everything from Thales to contemporary philosophy and know literally nothing about Buddhism or any other philosophy outside of our civilization. So in short, if we want to get onto the slides, at least I would suggest that from the beginning, Buddhism has had clearly, in my mind, unequivocally religious elements to it. It started with monastic tradition. Christianity did not, 31 centuries later. Monks suggest religion. It definitely, from the beginning, has entailed faith and devotion and worship and ritual. These are all earmarks of religion. So that's in from the beginning. It was not an outside adulteration. But having said that, Buddhism, from the very beginning, has always had philosophical elements. If you look at the discourse of the Buddha, he's raising issues of nature of consciousness, personal identity, and subject-object relationships, point after point. We in the West, in our tradition, naturally recognize, well, this is philosophical discourse, let alone what ensued later on in India with Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti, and so forth and so on, and into Tibet. This is clearly, this is philosophy. But I would argue tonight also that using our own constructs of religion, philosophy, and now science, we can take our notion of science and then with those kind of spectacles look back into the Buddhist tradition and see, do we recognize anything here that bears the earmarks of science? And that in the sense of careful observation, presenting hypotheses, being skeptical, pragmatic, putting it to the empirical test, seeing whether your hypothesis is true. And once again, coming back to the issue of very meticulous, careful observation and experimentation. Do we find that in Buddhism? And you'll see I argue tonight, emphatically yes, unequivocally yes. Did the Buddhists call that science? No, they didn't speak English. Nor did they call their monks religious, nor did they call Nagarjuna philosophy. They called this Dharma, and it's all melded together. So they didn't think they were putting on different hats. A dear and late friend of mine, Francisco Varela, neuroscientist, but he would often comment in the conferences that he and I attended, said, now I'm going to take off my scientific hat and put on my Buddhist hat. Now I'm going to take that off and put on my philosopher hat, because I studied Husserl and Heidegger, and so it's hats, hats, hats. Buddhists don't have hats, they shave their heads in the person. So tonight we're getting into some principles. Principles of Buddhist science that I'm going to be launching from the West because I find the interface is really fascinating to my mind, and I'm going to look first of all at the issue of revolutions. I don't mean progress, I don't mean further research and discoveries, I mean bold insights that radically transform humanity, or at least specific cultures, very sense of their position in the universe, the type of world they believe they're living in. And so I would say, one, started with Copernicus, Galileo was seminal. We're talking about the first scientific revolution, which was clearly based or rooted in the physical sciences, astronomy and physics itself. But I would suggest this was a crucial element. It's not the only one by any means. I won't elaborate on the role of mathematics, for example. But here is one. Galileo took a pre-existing technology, it was invented in Holland. He refined it, I think it was a 20-power telescope. He refined it, and then he used it in unprecedented ways to make precise observations of celestial phenomena, such as the moon, craters, the sun, sunspots, Jupiter, the moons of Jupiter, and the list goes on, making, as far as we know, unprecedented observations. And I would argue that the fact that we had a true revolution in astronomy and the physical sciences was dependent upon that element. Not that uniquely, not that alone, that was crucial. That he was interested in celestial phenomena, and he found a way, and then of course this has been enhanced up to the Hubble telescope, of making precise, rigorous, sophisticated observations of the phenomena that we were interested in. Now, was Copernicus or Galileo, were these the first people interested in the stars, the planets, and so forth? Well, obviously not. Astronomers had been at this for centuries, and they made actually a lot of progress. They knew a lot about the relative motion of the planets, the movement of the stars, the constellations. They could predict lunar and solar eclipses. That's pretty formidable. But it was not astronomy. And I would suggest one key element that distinguishes astrology, which is all about correlates, about terrestrial and celestial correlations. They were professional at correlates, and they were folk astronomers. They did not have a telescope, they did not have mathematics. Galileo had a telescope, and he's often called the father of modern science. The breakthrough there, Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, and the ongoing revolution that I would say started with the death of Copernicus. That's when his material was published. He was afraid to publish it earlier. I would say the revolution, this is my own speculation, maybe I'm wrong, but here it is, that the revolution there started with the death of Copernicus, something like 1543 or so, and it culminated with the work of Newton. So it's about 140 years. 1687, I think, was Principia when it came out, his major work. About 140 years. Obviously, after that and through the 18th century, enormous strides, but it wasn't a revolution. It was doing the hard work of carrying out the implications and further research based upon the revolution that took place. But the real revolution, I think, kind of reached its culmination, its finale, with Newton. And then it was working out a whole bunch of fascinating and important details. Electromagnetism also came into Maxwell and Silver and companies. But there was one, and it took about 140 years for it to begin and then come into full flowering with Newton. We've had one, the first one in physics. That's very significant. But the first scientific revolution was not in the cognitive sciences, it wasn't in the life sciences, it was in the physical sciences. But then we have Van Leeuwenhoek, he was way back in the 17th century, used the microscope to make precise observations of minute life forms. That was not sufficient. He is not known as a great revolutionary in the life sciences. But there's a key element that eventually wound up playing a crucial role. I think there's another revolution that took place in the life sciences. I would suggest the instigator of that was Darwin, talking 1860s. So we all know this work. It was picked up, that is, another angle was brought in by Mendel a couple of decades later. So genetics was started, but not really as a science. It was kind of like some good pointers. And in fact, the work of Darwin and Mendel really didn't get much attention or acceptance in the scientific community in the 19th century. But along comes the 20th century, and then Crick and Watson in 1952, discovery of double helix, the genome project in the 90s. By then, we have, again, about 140 years. If we say the revolution in the life sciences, with Darwin, natural selection, genetics, all of this is now, I would say the revolution's over. The research is terrific, but it's ongoing, and the course is set. The geneticists know what to do, and they have the technology, and they know how to proceed forward. But the revolution that took place, starting with Darwin, and then Mendel, a key ingredient, and then really developing momentum in the 20th century, I say that the revolution is over, and now it's good, solid science proceeding on course. 140 years. That may be an accident, but that's about exactly what it is. So we've had one in the physical sciences, followed by one in the life sciences. But physics is the most mature of all the natural sciences we have, and it's been around long enough, 400 years, that we're fortunate enough now to have witnessed two revolutions in the physical sciences. And the second one started right on the money on 1900, Max Planck. 5 years later, Einstein, quantum mechanics, relativity theory. It was existentially shattering, or at least deeply troubling, for physicists trained in 19th century physics. No more absolute space, no more absolute time, no more absolute velocity except for the velocity of light, no more absolute location. questions about measurement problem, whether that which you're studying even exists independent of the system of measurement. Causality, can you count on it at all levels, or is there a level in which there is no causality? This is very troubling for people who love physics and invest their lives in physics. This was a true revolution. It was not a nuancing, it was not a minor adjustment, it was getting right down to the roots and shaking them radically. So people knew they were troubled, and we have these generations from about 1900 to 1930 was the great heyday of this period. And I would suggest that that second revolution in physical sciences is not over. There are too many fundamental issues that were raised by quantum mechanics, relativity, that have not been resolved. One of the most important one is the measurement problem. Is what is the status of unobserved phenomena that you're studying in the quantum mechanical realm? Another one is that we have these two magnificent theories of general relativity and quantum mechanics, and they have not been fused. That which Einstein saw for, 20 years or so, and did not find, they've still not found yet. And so I would say that was a glorious revolution. It's only about 100 years old, and it's not over yet. There are too many fundamental issues that have not been resolved, so I think the excitement is still there. And a lot of people in string theory, for example, feel they are on the cutting edge of bringing that revolution to its full flowering, as we have in the Genome Project for the life sciences. But now I'd like to move to the area that's going to be the primary focus of tonight's presentation, and that is the cognitive sciences. For either of the two great revolutions in the physical sciences to have occurred, you had to have the experimental means for making precise observations and, where possible, experimentation on the phenomena you're interested in. Without Rutherford's work, without others working in the field of atomic physics, elementary physics, you just have a bunch of theories, but you don't have the science of quantum mechanics. You've got to have precise means of observation. Otherwise, you just have a bunch of theories that don't get resolved or don't get tested empirically. Likewise, about life sciences. If you don't have microscopes, if you don't have the wonderful technology for observing genes, DNA, molecules and the like, cells and so forth, you do not have the science. So we come to the cognitive sciences. What means do we currently have here in 2005 for making professional grade, sophisticated, rigorous, reliable, direct observation of the phenomena in question, namely mental phenomena? By this, I do not refer to the neural correlates, because we don't really know the relationship. We know there are correlations. We don't know the nature of the correlations of neural and mental phenomena. We just know that they are related, but we don't know the nature of the relationship itself, and likewise for behavior. And so we can infer mental states based upon the behavior that is produced by mental processes. We can infer mental states based upon the neural processes that are contributing to their production or emergence. There's great brain science by now. There's very sophisticated behavioral science. And when it comes to observing the mental phenomena themselves, I would suggest that right now, 2005, this remains at the level of folk psychology. Unlike astronomy, unlike physics, and unlike biology, they have not yet found cognitive science. The whole breadth of it has not found rigorous means or devised rigorous means for observing and experimenting on the phenomena themselves. I think this is my hypothesis, I think this is a major reason why, despite the fact that we've had psychology, a science, an empirical science of the mind, since 1879 is the common date given, when experimental psychology started with Wundt and Tishman. Why, given all of that history, almost 140 years, I would argue we have yet to have a single revolution in the cognitive sciences. The kind of assumptions that underlay the research of Tishner, Wundt, and others in that field are basically exactly the assumptions that we bring today. There has been no revolution. There's been a lot of knowledge. The behaviorists discovered a lot, Pavlov, and so forth and so on. The neuroscientists are studying, learning a lot about the brain. But where's the revolution? From the time of William James, Tishner, Wundt, and so forth, where was that insight? Where was that revolutionary insight that radically changed our very sense of the nature of the mind? Like hallelujah, eureka. We never imagined that could be the case. That's not happened. That's not happened. The assumptions that would remain largely unchallenged, the fundamental assumptions underlying the research in the field, and most importantly, the actual observation of the phenomena themselves, remains at the level of folk psychology. I would suggest something here. Another hypothesis, and we will get to Buddhism soon, is a hierarchy. And that is, if we imagine bracketing our intelligence, bracketing our knowledge, bracketing our modes of observation. And imagine that you're a physicist with no knowledge of biology at all. And so you are confined to knowledge of the laws of physics. I would suggest that the laws of physics alone do not define, predict, or explain the emergence of life in the universe. Equally importantly, if you confine yourself to the tools of physics, again with no knowledge of biology at all, just physics, there is none of the instruments of physics itself enables you to detect the presence or absence of life. You will see reverse entropy in specific areas. But life itself, it is alive, it's dead, those are words that don't mean anything in physics. It's alive, it's dead, it's ill, they don't mean anything. Those words mean a lot to us in English and mean a lot in biology, but they mean nothing. Alive and dead means nothing in physics. And so physics is great for what it does, but it does not predict or explain the emergence of life in the universe, plant life, animal life, and life of any sort. And I would say in an exactly analogous way, the laws of biology alone, if you confine yourself, and now here very specifically to neuroscience, to neurobiology, the laws of biology alone do not define, predict, or explain the emergence of consciousness in the universe, nor is consciousness detected by the instruments of biology. fMRI, EEG, ERP, you name it. We don't have it. We have a name for a tool that doesn't exist. It's called a psychometer. A psychometer is a gizmo that you could point it to you and it goes, and you point it to this little and it would be silent, and you point it to a plant and it would do something. You'd point it to a human fetus in the first trimester and it would do something. But we have no psychometer. There is no instrument in the world, a physical instrument created in the context of technology, that detects the absence or presence of consciousness in anything. Consciousness is invisible to the tools of biology. Consciousness is not defined in terms of the terminology of biology. The emergence of consciousness is unpredicted and unexplained in terms of biology. So those hardy souls that are hoping against hope that the mystery of consciousness, its origins, its necessary and sufficient causes, its nature, its functions, and so forth, will be unveiled by neuroscientists, I think is a pipe dream. There's no empirical evidence to support that. Not when it's invisible, undefinable. They may as well be trying to investigate Casper, the friendly ghost in the machine. If it's invisible and undefinable, how exactly are you going about studying it? Well, they do study, and this is by no means ridicule of neuroscience. I'm working with multiple teams of neuroscientists, but they need to work in conjunction with somebody else, and they do. And so the wonderful work in finding neural correlates of states of consciousness invariably relies upon somebody's first-person report. And it's often undergraduate students brought in with a little bulletin in the psych department saying, for $10 an hour, come in, and we're going to ask you some questions and ask you to do some tasks. And likewise in behavioral psychology, same thing. You don't detect consciousness by studying behavior. So I find this really quite hilarious, actually. With great admiration for people working in cognitive psychology, behaviorism, true admiration, and certainly for the neuroscientists, it's fantastic technology, brilliant breakthroughs, but for them to draw the correlations with actual states of consciousness, they have to rely upon total amateurs. The undergraduates who are paid $10 an hour in a $10 million lab by people who have had maybe 10 or 12 years of professional training. And then you're relying on amateurs to actually give you reports from person experience. Anybody who designed that should be fired. But nobody designed it, it just happened. So, what can be done? William James, writing more than 100 years ago, made exactly this comment, which frankly, in not some very specific respects, I think holds true today. And that is, psychology indeed is today hardly more than what physics was before Galileo. From one perspective, that's totally unfair, no longer true. He was one of the founders, so of course it was at a primitive level. Now, 110 years later, of course it's much more advanced, there's no question about it. So again, no disparagement intended at all, except in one particular area. In terms of the sophisticated, rigorous observation of mental events themselves, mental phenomena, we are right now what he described in 1890s. An interesting context for this, and again from his own writings, and I've heard this reiterated by John Searle, for example, contemporary philosopher of mind. But the problems of philosophy are those that have not yet been solved by science. So you have professional philosophers in disciplines where we don't know much yet, and the philosophers can still make a living. As soon as you actually start knowing something, then the philosophers are out of work, and then you have a scientific department of that topic. So as late as the 19th century, you still had philosophers of atoms. And there were some inspired by chemistry, others were inspired by physics, but they didn't know what the heck atoms were because they didn't know how to observe them. So there was still a philosophy of atoms. Nobody makes a living as a philosopher of atoms anymore, because we have a science that supplanted any philosophical speculations about them. But I think it's noteworthy that we do still have philosophers of mind. You can still make a living. What does that tell us? That it's a mixed bag. Now, William James recognized this problem, that when you're dealing with mental phenomena, you're dealing with phenomena in some respect very unlike all of the other phenomena that had been very successfully studied hitherto since the time of Copernicus. And he recognized, as he states here, that if you were going to have a science of the mind, this is truly a science of mental phenomena, and not just the neural and behavioral correlates of mental processes. So this very famous statement by him, introspective observation, or what we nowadays call metacognition, is what we have to rely on first and foremost in all of this. The word introspection need hardly be defined. It means, of course, looking into our own minds and reporting what we there discover. Everyone agrees that what we there discover, that we there discover states of consciousness. I have a great admiration for William James. I think he filled a role for psychology that Einstein filled for physics. The great difference was that there have been many successors of Einstein building on his work, developing on his work. In contrast to that, William James was smothered to death. He died in 1911. In 1910, John Watson started the whole school of behaviorism, and they basically steamrolled his work, his emphasis on introspection, so many of the brilliant insights he had from his first-person observation about the nature of attention and perception and so forth. John Watson, right through D.F. Skinner, about a 50-year period, basically wanted to do their best to studiously ignore subjective experience and have a science of mind that was really nothing more than science of stimuli and response. So behaviorism. I find it hard to avoid the conclusion that people who want to study the mind by ignoring the mind, I find it hard to ignore the conclusion that they're mentally impaired. In a very particular way. I don't mean stupid, but I do mean mentally impaired. People can be very brilliant, creative, ingenious, and be mentally impaired. And I think actually, without abuse, I think there is a type of deficit operating here, of an atrophication of ability to monitor one's own mental states. Because if you had a honed ability to be aware of your own mental states, for example, if you were an accomplished lucid dreamer, you can enter a dream and vividly know that you are dreaming, sustain the dream, knowing that you're dreaming. You could never come out of your dream and say, there are no such things as subjective mental states. There is no such thing as consciousness. I mean, I can quote Skinner and Watson both to make the most weird statements. And I can only assume they're drawing from their own experience of a radical atrophication of their own metacognitive abilities. I wish they'd had treatment before they actually started the whole. William James was on the right mark. I think he exactly had it right, because he had a broad and wonderfully non-dogmatic approach to this burgeoning field of the scientific study of the mind. He suggested a threefold approach. Studying the mind by way of neural correlates, good idea. Studying the mind by way of behavioral correlates, behavioral expressions of mental states and processes, good idea. And in those two areas, tremendous progress has been made, which I respect. But he said first, foremost, and always, look at the phenomena themselves, like Galileo did, like von Leeuwenhoek did, like Crick and Watson did, like the people in the Genome Project did. Keep on looking at the phenomena. Let that be primary and not the correlates, just because they're easy. But he was not a naive man. He recognized that introspection is difficult and fallible. Contrary to at least some interpretations of Descartes, it's difficult and fallible. The difficulty is simply, however, he says, that of all observation of whatever kind. The only safeguard is in the final consensus of our farther or later knowledge about the thing in question, later views correcting earlier ones, until at last the harmony of a consistent system is reached. there's a good broad statement about the nature of observation. Whether it's astronomy, whether it's genetics, observations are fallible, even of course with the use of technology and computers. They break down, they get glitches, they produce artifacts, which are not simply objectively measured. Actually, it's an artifact of the system. So you keep on making observations, and multiple people make it, and then eventually you come to the harmony of a consistent system of report. So introspection is difficult, but it's not impossible. The problems can be surmounted. I'm putting together two things that I don't see that William James did explicitly, but if I think I could revive him and talk to him about it, I think he would see it, because he's much smarter than I am. And that is, if you're going to develop a science of the mind in which introspection plays a key role, attention, what he calls sustained voluntary attention, has to be a key player. And that is, he recognized, as so many of us have, that attention, when we try to direct it, I'm sure many of you are meditators, and so you know what it's like to sit down in your cushion and say, now I will follow my breath. And 3 seconds later you're doing something entirely different. Now I will start doing anything, a visual image, I'll start a mantra, and 10 seconds later you're doing something else. And so what we're dealing with here is something that contemplatives throughout history, at least the last 3,000 years, have grappled with, and that is the tool with which that you're using in order to investigate the nature of mental events. The tool itself, your attentional faculty, your attentional skills, are very flawed. Attention is heavily prone in a habitually imbalanced mind to oscillating between excitation and laxity, excitation and laxity. Excitation getting fragmented out, laxity imploding into dullness, lethargy, sleepiness, and then falling fast asleep. And so the ability of sustaining voluntary attention that's clear, that's luminous, that's intelligent, and continuously, coherently attentive is going to be a key player. Rather like, I would say this is a close analogy, rather like Galileo first refining his tool, firmly mounting it on a good solid tripod, polishing the lenses, make sure it's clear, and make sure you've got a nice clear day, preferably in Arizona, or up on the mountaintop in Hawaii, but someplace you don't have smog, for example. And so what you get out of that is stability, and you get vividness, which I think you will not refute me, stability of the platform and the clarity of the optics or whatever means of observation. These two are both indispensable. I've heard that some of the observations made with the Hubble telescope have to go on for hours. I heard, and you would be the expert here, but I've heard that the Hubble telescope is directed to a very small portion of space that seemed to be black. It seemed like there was nothing there. So I heard. Through our eyes. Through our eyes. But through a long exposure, they found not only was it not empty, but it was filled with galactic clusters of the light. But the long exposure was necessary. If that Hubble telescope were waddling around like a drunken sailor, then that would definitely inhibit or impair the quality of observations made. Well, here's the drunken sailor, it's called Alan Wallace, trying to attend to something, and 3 seconds later, my telescope is wobbling, gyrating around. Imagine doing genetics with a microscope. You kind of jump around the table as you're trying to make your observations. So this possession of a steady faculty of attention, he says, and he's speaking very broadly, is unquestionably a great boon in so many ways. Those who have it can work more rapidly and with less nervous wear and tear. But now here's the catch. I'm inclined to think that no one who is without it naturally can by any amount of drill or discipline attain it in a very high degree. Its amount is probably a fixed characteristic of the individual. So the good news is it's really important, and the bad news is you're stuck. Nothing you can do about it. It's like your genetic heritage, you're stuck with it, tough luck. And he was making this conclusion not because he was unintelligent or he was dogmatic. He was making this conclusion drawn upon the evidence that was available at the time he was writing. There was no compelling evidence that through training, attention was very plastic and it could be refined to exceptional degrees. Because he was writing in Victorian Boston, not exactly the contemplative planet Earth at that time. If he'd been living at at exactly the same time, I think he would have laughed hilariously at this proposal. For where he was, this was a very reasonable proposal. So we're out of luck there, and this assumption that attention is not plastic, attention cannot be trained, as to my mind, I find it really one of the most astonishing things in contemporary, which is to say 20th century, early 21st century cognitive science, that virtually nothing has been done in challenging that assumption of taking a normal person's attention and then wondering a simple scientific question, Is attention plastic? Is it malleable? Can it be refined in tangible, measurable ways through training? I co-chaired a panel on attention at MIT about 14 months ago. My co-chair was Jonathan Cohen, a very fine neuroscientist, done his life work in the field of attention, and he told me quite candidly, we haven't done it. I find that astonishing, especially when William James flagged this as being of immense importance, but he also flagged it as probably there's nothing we can do about it. I think there are a lot of reasons it wasn't looked into. My point here, as we finally venture into Buddhism, is the mere fact that we've not looked into something and not made any progress doesn't necessarily mean that no one else has. And that's a tough pill to swallow. It's really, I mean, it's such a large pill that I think many scientists and philosophers simply won't swallow it. They can't imagine that we're not the best at everything. And it sounds ridiculous when you say that. But I know a number of people in the field, in cognitive science, philosophy of mind, that if we haven't done it, nobody's done it. And that's kind of like, that's it. Well, that's foolishness. That's ethnocentricity in a very crude and uninformed way. Let's look at least some hypotheses here. And I would suggest, bearing in mind Galileo, the father of modern science, I would suggest that Gautama, the Buddha Shakyamuni, historical Buddha, did something comparable to what Galileo did. That is, what I'm proposing here, of course, is that highly refined, sustained voluntary attention, with a high degree of stability and vividness, is to the study of mind what a telescope is to the study of celestial phenomena. That is my fundamental premise. If I'm wrong, you really may as well leave now. I think some coffee shops are still open. But did the Buddha, we'll call that samadhi, that's one great word for it, samadhi, very highly focused, luminous, clear, bright attention, focused. Did he invent it? The answer is absolutely not. Unequivocally not. The refinement of attention skills in this general rubric of samadhi must have been quite an old discipline by the time Buddha came along 2,500 years ago. Because when he stepped out of his palace, left home, set out on his search for enlightenment, for understanding, liberation, the first thing he did was train first with one and then another highly, highly accomplished samadhi expert. And he was such a prodigy that within a matter of weeks or months, he, by the accounts we have presently, achieved the same state of samadhi realization that they did. And so that made him like just following the footsteps of other people. So why do we remember him and hardly anybody knows who he trained with? Well, Newton has this famous statement that he stood on the shoulders of giants. And I think he was referring to Kepler and Galileo in particular. That without them, he could not have done what he did, because he relied upon them. So if he said, if I see further, it's because I stand on the shoulder of giants. I think Gautama didn't use this terminology, but I think he stood on the shoulders of giants. He took a pre-existing technology of training the attention, because it's much more of a technology than it is a science, developing the tool, like a microscope, a telescope, and so forth. Pre-existing, but he used it in unprecedented ways. Just a few days ago, or maybe it was yesterday, I read a paper by a contemporary philosopher of mind, and he was writing really from the Hindu perspective, and the whole tenor of the paper was that the point of meditation is to still the mind, to overcome all perturbations of consciousness, get to a point of vacuity, of total no object, and lo and behold, bliss arises out of that. You come to a state of pure consciousness, and mazel tov. Congratulations. We're doing a great cross-cultural. But that was the whole point. Still the mind. Get to a point of contemptless awareness, pure consciousness, bliss, sat chit ananda. That's ultimate reality, pure consciousness, bliss. This is the truth, this is liberation. But basically, samadhi was both the means and the end. And that's exactly what the teachers of Gautama said. When they trained him in samadhi, he said, get to this, this is liberation, this is as good as it gets. But he was, if I could use a prosaic term for a person who was not prosaic, he was a genius. And what he recognized, which his teachers did not, was the samadhi itself, what psychologists call the state effect of being in samadhi, was great. It was all that it was pumped up to be. But what happens when you come out of samadhi? You get off your meditation cushion, you start walking around, you bump into something. What he found was that our basic predilection to, our vulnerability to mental afflictions, cognitive distortions, mental imbalances of the four kinds I spoke of this morning, had not really been uprooted. He was still as afflicted as he was before the samadhi. The samadhi was a great vacation, but it didn't irreversibly heal, balance, or uproot the afflicted tendencies of the mind, and therefore all of the resultant dukkha, or misery, from such affliction. And so even though his teacher said, come and sit on the throne with us, you know, you are a master, you've achieved what we've achieved, he respectfully bowed out and said, it's not enough. And so what he did was, I think, truly revolutionary. There was a lot of great work being done before him. But he, like Galileo, took this highly, highly refined, focused attention, extraordinary states of samadhi, and then applied them to investigating the nature of the mind. As far as I could tell, he was the great instigator. He was the pioneer. He was the revolution. And in so doing, he shattered, or at least he certainly profoundly challenged, many of the most basic assumptions of Indian worldviews at that time. It was truly revolutionary. And that revolution has continued to ricochet ever since. He was like Galileo in this way of taking sustained attention and using it in unprecedented ways to explore states of consciousness and their objects by posing hypotheses, by posing questions, and then empirically investigating what the case is. That is called vipassana, or insight. And he made this fundamental statement about the type of mind needed, the quality of consciousness needed to be able to probe the nature of reality, when he said, a mind that is established in equipoise, the mind that is brought to a sublime state of balance, comes to know reality as it is. So he sets the stage for a science of the mind, a science of transformation. The basic framework, I'm sure many of you are familiar with, the indispensable foundation is ethics. There are many ways of glossing that, but what I would like to suggest in this context is ethics plays a crucial role in Buddhist inquiry, in Buddhist science of the mind, far more important, far more consequential than ethics plays in science. Ethics in science, I've had a lot of conversations about this, I'm sure I'll have more, but the fundamental ethic in science is don't fudge your data. Don't lie about your data. There's an analog in Buddhism, and that is don't lie about your state of realization. If you're a Buddhist monk and you lie about that, you've just stopped being a Buddhist monk. You have blown it, you've been fired. You've lost your tenure, you're expelled from the university. You are out. It's that serious. And I think it's pretty comparable if you have a scientist with a tenure position who fudged his data and published it. Well, I don't know about losing tenure, but you can call that deep doo-doo. And so there's a comparability there. But I think we also know that one may have a lot of psychological problems, including things like arrogance, hyper-competitiveness, nastiness, mean-spiritedness, small-mindedness, and so forth and so on, and yet still in the lab do first-rate work. It doesn't help you, but I don't think you will be overlooked for a Nobel Prize because you're not a very nice person. In Buddhism, since the instrument you're using to make your investigations is your own mind, if you don't have an ethical basis, then your quality of life is going to undermine the degree of mental balance you need to cultivate in order to do the real work of inquiry, of vipassana, of insight. So it's not a nice ornament to Buddhist inquiry. It is actually empirically, it's an indispensable foundation. It's a whole way of life that is conducive to balancing and honing the mind. Whereas if you do serious Buddha meditation and you go off and get drunk, or become a sex maniac, and do a lot of weird, unwholesome things, and then come back to your meditation cushion, it's going to be one step forward and about 3 miles back. And you will not progress. It's an empirical issue, not a dogmatic or religious issue. The central theme, which many of you know by the name of samadhi, I'm glossing that in this context, is being much more than just learning how to focus your mind single-pointedly. That's kind of the tip of the iceberg. But if you don't balance the mind more broadly, that focus will be extremely tenuous, vulnerable, and short-lasting. And so much more broadly speaking, mental balance, I think, is really the kind of the backbone, the core, the central feature, not the cutting edge, but the core feature that enables the third level of contemplative insight to really take off to its work. I spoke about these 4 elements at some length this morning, so now I'll just mention them by name. But when we're dealing in this broad rubric of samadhi, bear in mind in the Buddhist partition of the Buddhist teachings, you have these sutras, you have Abhidhamma and you have Vinaya. The sutras are correlated with samadhi. So these many, many discourses coming under the category of sutras are not all about just developing attention. By any means, probably a small fraction of them are. But I would suggest, much more broadly speaking, they are talking about cognitive balance, developing wholesome desires and aspirations, attentional balance, which is very much about samadhi, or shamatha, cognitive balance, which is developing clarity of mindfulness and so forth, and then emotional balance, needs no commentary. That, I would suggest, is really, those are our central themes of this central feature of this practice. Whoops. I will go through this also rather rapidly, although now we're kind of honing in on some points that are crucial for the Buddhist science of the mind. Specifically for the attentional training, again I'm saying this is an analog to a telescope for the mind, or a microscope for the mind, the mode of rigorous observation. If you've not trained attention, then your introspective abilities are going to be seriously impaired. A core theme that's not brought out in all schools of Buddhism, but I found experientially it is awfully important, is relaxation. And that is, meditation is not an ambitious endeavor with furrowed brow, clenched fist, gritted teeth, say I'm going to get there or bust kind of thing. It doesn't work that way. And if you try it, which I have, you get pooped out. But I don't frankly know of any form of meditation that works really well when you try your hardest. Gritting your teeth, having an enormous amount of desire and personal ambition. Let's get there as quickly as we possibly can, and now let's meditate intensely. It doesn't work that way. So this sense of being at ease, a sense of relaxation, of looseness, which is not flaking out, but it does entail a quality of looseness. So Herbert Benson was on the right track as far as he went. There is a relaxation response that is induced by meditation, but for heaven's sakes, don't equate meditation with that. The second one is crucial, and I've already alluded to this, the stability of attention, the coherence of attention over time, maintaining continuity implies a stillness and coherence of the object, of the attention on an object over time. That by itself is not sufficient because we all enjoy a high degree of stability whenever we fall deep asleep. Deep, dreamless sleep, the mind is very stable. It would be a great meditative period, except for one other feature is missing, and that is vividness. Few of us have clear recollections of what it was like to be deep asleep. We have lots of experience, but not a whole lot of accounts of what's it like, and that's because there are not many lucid, dreamless sleepers. It's possible in principle, it's hard to do in practice. Vividness entails brightness, high resolution, high focus of attention. If you bring those three qualities together, you have a winning package. How to do that, again, since I mentioned it this morning, I'll be very brief now. The cultivation of mindfulness, one of the kind of two core faculties in this endeavor. And again, very briefly, in this context of training attention, mindfulness is here defined as the faculty of sustaining voluntary attention continuously upon a familiar object. So it has the connotation of remembrance, or remembering to remember. Remembering to remember. It's a type of prospective memory. Prospective memory. Remembering to do, now it's 8:03, at 8:05, somebody raise your hand. You don't have to do it, but that kind of thing, I'm saying it right now, and then remember to do something in 2 minutes, or the next time I say Galileo, raise your hand. That's a memory, but it's a prospective memory. It's remembering to do something in the future. That's what this type of meditation is. You're sitting down and saying, now for 25 minutes, a half an hour, 5 hours, whatever, I will attend to my breath. That means in an ongoing way, you're going to remember to do what you set out to do in the first place. So the one word in Tibetan tempa, Sanskrit smriti, sati, the one word, and these are very close translations, all have the dual connotation of mindfulness and recollection. That by itself is not sufficient. There needs to be some monitoring of how the attention is functioning, whether it in fact is falling into laxity or excitation. There needs to be a monitoring, which we'll call meta-attention, it's called shijin in Tibetan. In this context, it's the faculty of monitoring the quality of attention, recognizing as swiftly as possible the occurrence of excitation and laxity. And to go back to this triad briefly now, to point out some salient features of this type of meditative training or attentional training that sets it apart from all other types of attention that are known in modern cognitive psychology that I know of, and I work fairly extensively with people in the field. One of the common themes that you'll encounter is that when According to modern cognitive psychology, there's studies of air traffic controllers, jet fighter pilots, musicians, mathematicians, chess players, and the like, is that when the attention is in a state of high arousal, you're very vivid. It's clear, it's bright, it's sharp, it's very vividly engaged. That is effortful. It's strenuous, it's tiring, it will poop you out over time. Even one might wonder about professional musicians. They get into the flow, they merge with their music, they become the symphony, they become the music. True, and it's also exhausting. I've spoken with a number of professional musicians. When they are on stage, it's a solo, they're part of an orchestra. At the end of 3 hours, they're tired. Let alone jet fighter pilots, chess players, mathematicians, and so forth. It's a quality of attention that's strenuous, and it doesn't get less strenuous as you continue in the endeavor. Radically unlike that, any of you who have studied shamatha, or the training in samadhi, in the Buddhist tradition, you know that the greatest amount of effort required to do this training effectively is at the beginning. And that's not the greatest amount of effort you can apply. You apply effort and then you loosen up a bit. You don't do pedal to the metal all the way through the meditative session. You arouse the attention and then you lighten up a little bit. And as you proceed in a sequential, gradual development of attention, the magnitude of effort required tapers off until when you come to a very, very balanced state, called shamatha meditative quiescence, calm abiding, the students of Jeffrey Hopkins. At that point, it actually becomes effortless. So this is an extraordinary anomaly, that the mind is extremely bright, very, very vivid, and totally relaxed. As relaxed as if you were fast asleep. So Tsongkhapa himself, one of the great 15th century masters of Tibetan Buddhism, says when you achieve that, your samadhi, this clarity, vividness, coherence of attention, slips right into your dream state, right into sleep, effortlessly. It's a derivative effect of such training. So that makes it an enormous anomaly. And I know from some personal experience that when they meditate 18 hours a day for months on end, at the end of the day, you'll get tired, but you're not tired like the effort exerted in any of these skills that I mentioned, preparing for an exam, writing, answering email, and so forth. It's not at all like that. It's kind of a sweet end of the day kind of thing, rather than torqued out, wasted, exhausted, stressed out. If that's what you feel like at the end of meditation, back to the drawing boards, because you're doing it wrong. So that's one point. Stability, if we break this down in terms of the constructs of Buddhist psychology, stability really translates over into a homogeneity of successive moments of cognition. Buddhism, like William James and others now, contemporary cognitive psychology and cognitive neurophysiology, regards attention, regards mental phenomena as being pulses, not a continuous stream, but pulses of cognition arising in dependence upon pulses of stimulant or pulses of neuronal activity. But it's a pulsing type of thing, and William James knew that 110 years ago. But it's not just a continuous flat. It's like staccato. And that's exactly what Buddhism has been saying all along. And so if you imagine that you have something on the order of about 1,000 pulses per second, moments of cognition, and that's an order of magnitude correct for Buddhism, and actually for cognitive science as well. The best guess is about that order of magnitude, about 1 millisecond per pulse. What this entails then is in a given second, however many of those pulses may actually ascertain their object, and most of them don't. But there's homogeneity. So if I were focusing my attention on you, I would get you. See, high density of being where I want to be, and an occasional explosion, not just there's one view, but one major one, is that it's 1/65th of the finger snap. That's how long the moment of cognition is. The finger snap, the experts tell me, is about 1/10 of a second. 1/650th of a second. I'm going to round off to milliseconds, and there we are. Most of those moments of cognition in a second don't ascertain anything. It's too brief. You get clusters of moments of cognition on the same object, and then you can report afterwards, I saw that, I was aware of that. But only with a cluster, maybe 10, 15, 20, or 50 of them, kind of cluster together, and then there's enough momentum to kind of break through, and then you can say, I saw this, it becomes an ascertaining awareness. I suggest that just like stability is a plastic quality, that is, it can be honed and find vividness as well, and what this would entail is a higher frequency and resolution of cognition, such that in a given second or 5-second interval, you're getting more hits per second. So if you're getting 10 hits per second, 1 every 100 milliseconds, when you start out, your normal untrained mind. So if you show that person a stimulus that lasts only 50 milliseconds, they say, what? They don't get it. It's just beneath the threshold of consciousness. If you train that person and heighten the resolution, heighten vividness of attention, they'll start picking up things at 50 milliseconds. Continue to train, they'll start picking up things at 30 milliseconds. Continue to train, and we can ask where's the ceiling. I think that spectrum right there is exactly the spectrum of vividness. It's a temporal resolution, but it also plays out in a given moment. How much detail can you discern? It's kind of a spatial resolution in addition to temporal resolution. In a single instant, how much detail can you get? It's like, let's say it lasts a half a second. You can all detect something in a half a second. In a half a second, how much information can you snag? Or if you're doing a mental visualization, Buddhists will often visualize something like the Buddha Shakyamuni. Do you see the whites of his eyes? Do you see the color of the hair? Do you recognize how the feet are placed? What was the posture of the right hand? And so forth. How much resolution? Or was it kind of a yellow blur? Well, if it's a yellow blur, that's low resolution. You can see that he has 5 fingernails, 5 fingers, and they're that far apart. That's high resolution. So that would be a little bit of unpacking. What's it like? Because this is an area where the West is just weak, and it has been for a very long time. We've never been very good at this. The early Christian fathers, some of the monastics in medieval Europe, they certainly took a good crack at it and made some progress. But I would say from all the literature I've read and everything I've acquired from experts in the field, they just weren't as good at it. The Indians were really good. The Indic traditions coming out of India, like Tibet and Burma and so forth, they really nailed this one. And what's it like when you achieve a state of calm abiding or meditative quiescence? Padmasambhava, this great 8th century master who was seminal in bringing Buddhism to Tibet, declares that flawless quiescence, when you achieve this sublime state of attentional balance, is like an oil lamp that is unmoved by the air. Wherever the attention is placed, it is unwaveringly present. Attention is vividly clear without being sullied by laxity, lethargy, or dimness. Wherever the attention is directed, it is steady and sharp and pointed, and unmoved by adventitious thoughts, it is straight. In this way, a flawless meditative state arises in one's mind stream, and until this happens, it is important that the mind is settled in its natural state. This is the mind in its natural state, which means its unperturbed state, its unconfigured state, undistorted state, by a myriad of mental imbalances. When it comes to a rest state, it is balanced, luminous, attentive. And he emphasized, until you achieve that, keep on working at it. Don't say, well, whatever, this is probably okay, and then leap on to more advanced practices. He said, stick there. He wasn't the only one. Another great one from Tibet, 15th century, Tsongkhapa, gives this wonderful metaphor about the same quality of attention. He said, in order to examine a wall tapestry in a dark room, if you illuminate it with a radiant, steady lamp, vividness and stability, you can vividly examine the images in the tapestry. But if the lamp is either dim, or even if it is bright, flickers due to the wind, your observation will be impaired. Likewise, there's a metaphor. In order to fathom the nature of any phenomenon, with penetrating intelligence supported by unwavering, sustained, voluntary attention, you can clearly observe the real nature of the phenomenon under investigation. So he's using, instead of the telescope, or microscope, or a myriad of external devices for enhancing our sensory engagement with the world, the Buddhists have been overwhelmingly concerned with refining the mind into the tool, and have made basically no progress at all in terms of developing a Tibetan telescope, a Tibetan microscope, or an Indian anything in that area. But now we come to the issue, so you develop your attention, maybe that's possible. But if you do develop this vivid, sustained, voluntary attention, is that really useful? Now we enter into philosophy, raising philosophical issues. Is it possible through introspection to develop a science of the mind where you're rigorously, systematically applying scientific methods, hypothesis, experimentation, observation? Can you do that introspectively, or is that really just a non-starter? Well, a lot of what we observe when we direct the mind so-called inwardly, and I do say so-called, I'm not quite sure where that word is. These problems are raised, and William James is one of them. He says, no subjective state, like a state of anger, a state of happiness, subjective state, no subjective state, whilst present, is its own object. Its object is always something else. The very act of naming them has momentarily detracted from their force. So he speaks of introspection here as a type of retrospection, but not getting something in real time. So let's imagine a subjective state. It's easy to go to negative ones, but let's take a kind of a positive one of euphoria or jubilation, delight. So imagine that arise. That's a subjective state, right? And so a sense of delight, just gladness arises. And then you turn this sharp beam of introspection upon the gladness. What's it like to be glad? It evaporates before your gaze. And what you may see, if you're very quick, is the fleeting shadow of the gladness going right around the corner and recalling what it was like maybe a tenth of a second earlier. But you were glad, almost certainly you were glad about something. If I'm glad about the shapely quality of your mustache, and it's a very fine mustache. I wish I could have one like that, but I will not in this lifetime. But what a cool mustache. The kind of gladness and rejoicing in the mustache arises, that as soon as, oh, I'm happy, then suddenly it tapers off. Because the focus, that gladness needs to be fed. I have to go back to the mustache, back to the mustache. It really is and I keep on refeeding it. But as soon as I direct the attention elsewhere, to namely, oh, here's a subjective state of gladness, it slips away. It is an observation, but it's a retrospective observation, and that may be very valuable. One could say that all of the observations made, this is a big statement, it may be false, but I think it's got some truth in it, all of the observations made in atomic physics are all retrospective. They are observations, it's superb technology. That is retrospective. You are looking at effects in a bubble chamber, effects in a particle accelerator. You're looking at effects of something that you should have been there. Because it just happened, maybe milliseconds or nanoseconds earlier. But it was just there, and you're getting what happened just after. And then making very short-term inferences about the immediate causes of the actual evidence that you're looking at. So the fact that a lot of introspection is retrospection is not debilitating. It's just the way things are. We've lost our, we're on another computer. I've lost my fonts. So the first one is Ratna Sutra. Ratna Sutra, which in one translation is like the crown jewel discourse of the Buddha. In which the Buddha, this is attributed to the Buddha, the Mahayana Sutra says, the mind cannot observe itself. That looks like a real showstopper. The mind cannot observe itself, just as a sword cannot cut itself and a fingertip cannot touch itself. Nor can it be seen in external sense objects. The mind will not be seen in the objects of the senses, like looking at a wristwatch and expecting to find the mind, nor can it be detected in the sense organs. A very disappointing prognosis for all the neuroscientists, who think they're going to find the mind in the brain. It is not to be found. It's nowhere to be found, but nor is the mind going to take itself as an object, bifurcate itself, and then look at itself. That doesn't happen either. That's rather daunting. And that didn't stop. Chandrakirti, we lost a diacritic mark there as well, but it's invisible. Chandrakirti, the great 7th century philosopher, makes this comment about the same theme. The actor, and this is your generic theme that can be applied specifically to the mind, the actor, the object of action, and the action itself are not identical. They must be distinct. So it is illogical to maintain that a cognition apprehends itself. That is, what it's attending to is exactly that which is attending. One and the same. So that doesn't happen. So that once again looks like introspection in the sense that the mind specting intro and observing itself is sabotaged from the beginning. The Abhidhamma Kosha brings this notion of the, and this is really finessing and we are running a bit short of time, but in the Abhidhamma Kosha literature we come up with this notion of pulses of cognition lasting on the order of 1 millisecond. And so it's the mind and then it has concomitant mental processes. So you have like a nest or a family of mental events arising simultaneously or concomitantly. And each pulse will be lasting on the order of a millisecond. But he says, when the primary consciousness and then the particular mental factors that go along with it, when they're engaged with an object, such as you or your mustache or what have you, they're all, like a football team, they're all oriented in the same direction. They're all looking at the same thing. Having said that, there's another hypothesis that's being looked into very carefully by cognitive psychologists right now. The Buddhist hypothesis is that this coherent attention of consciousness itself and then its concomitant mental factors can be directed to only one sense modality at a single moment. Now that seems to be very contrary to experience. I assume that you think you can listen to me and watch, you can listen to my voice and look at the visual impressions of my forehead in the same moment. And you can probably feel your buttocks against the cushion, and maybe simultaneously you can smell the fragrance in the air. The Buddhist response would be, that's because your minds are crude. My mind is crude. And that is, given how rapidly the pulsation of cognition occurs, that these things are blurred together. It would be like watching a motion picture and seeing smooth motion across a screen. Well, that never happens. That never ever happens. If you had a high enough temporal resolution of cognition, you see there's no smooth motion at all. It's all staccato, and in fact, nothing moves across the screen. You're just getting a blotch of white here, and then there's a blotch of white there, and then there's a blotch of white there, but it's just little blotches, but nothing moves across the screen at all. But it sure looks like it. And you also have a sense of simultaneously watching the screen and hearing the sound, whereas the Buddhist hypothesis here may very well be wrong, but at least it's a coherent one, it's an interesting one. And that is the mind, this focus of attention is moving so rapidly, back and forth between the auditory field, the visual field, maybe slipping into the tactile field, back to the visual field, that it's blending these all together into a coherent, multimodal experience world. But it's an illusion. Because in fact, in any single moment, you're actually only in one sense modality. It's true or false. That is the Buddhist theory. Shantideva. Shantideva, in the 9th chapter of this great text, A Guide to the Bodhisattva Way of Life, tackles the same issue. And that is if, and he's responding to his predecessors, especially in this context, responding to the Chittamatra view and mind-only view. If it's the case, as he's arguing, that consciousness does not take, or no mind state takes itself as an object, it doesn't bifurcate itself and then look at itself in the mirror as the same thing. If that's the case, then how is it that tonight at 9:05, when we all leave here, some of you may leave earlier, how is it that you'll recall being here, recall some of the words that I said, and you'll not only recall what's happening here, but you'll also recall being present. You'll recall that you heard it. You will recall your own responses, emotional responses, conceptual responses, and so forth. So how is it that when we remember past events, we remember not only a bunch of objects, but we remember being there? Now we know that's true. Doesn't that imply that in the earlier moment, there must have been a self-cognition of the mind knowing itself and concomitantly an awareness of the object? Otherwise, how could you possibly retrieve them? You can't remember something that you never knew in the first place. Here's his diagnosis, and I think it's quite brilliant. He says, when we remember seeing a certain event, maybe a patch of blue, we recall both the perceived event and ourselves perceiving the event. True statement. The two are recalled in an interrelated fashion without the perceiver apprehending himself during the original experience. The two are recalled in an interrelated fashion. What he's suggesting is, in the experience itself in the moment, we are having a system experience. That is, I'm experiencing once again your face, your mustache, and so forth, and it's a whole event. And I'm not having two separate mental events or processes taking place, my awareness of you and my awareness being aware of you. It's the whole system. And then later, retrospectively, we recall and we parse out, in a retroactive way, we parse out, this was the me part and that was the you part. But it's a retrospective disintegration of a previous system type of experience of being present. And so the long and short of this preceding discussion from William James and everything I've said thus far in Buddhism is that the awareness of subjective mental processes, such as emotions, which are subjective mental states, is actually, this introspection is actually a form of short-term memory. Very short-term retrospection. It could be a tenth of a second, half a second. It's still introspection, but it's not in real time. Again, that shouldn't daunt us. No astronomer would ever be daunted by that, because how often do you see a galaxy in real time? I think never. You're looking back into history, maybe millions or even billions of years. So talk about mindfulness, which is memory. Astronomers are doing that professionally every day of their lives. Your mindfulness of celestial events, even Mars, which is, minutes away, the moon, which is a couple of seconds away, The sun is minutes away again. There we go. All of our observations are all memory. It's all retrospective, and it's a darn good science. I mean, that was the first science that we had. So if it's crummy, then all the other ones are bad luck. But now let's get down to practice. And there's a practice that I marvel at, because it goes under various names, but one of them is called Sen-Nirvana, settling the mind into natural state. And I find it quite extraordinary. And the gist of it, a lot can be said about this, but not tonight, is rest your attention in the space of mental events. Now, right off the bat, some philosophers of mine will tell me there's no such thing. There is no such thing of space of mental events. There is no such thing as specting intro. Well, they're wrong. Sorry, there is so. Anybody who's had a lucid dream knows exactly, even a non-lucid dream. Where is your attention? Well, all of your 5 physical senses are dormant. They are gone. Nothing happening. You're not aware of having a physical body, no sights, no sounds, and are you therefore devoid of experience? Well, no, not even in a non-lucid dream, let alone a lucid dream. And most explicitly and obviously in a lucid dream, where you know you're dreaming as you're dreaming, your attention is entirely focused in the domain of mental space. And there you may experience replicas or facsimiles of sights and sounds and smells and tastes, a whole array of emotions, cognitive abilities, and so forth. Everything that's happening in the dream is all taking place in the space of the mind, and not in the space of vision, hearing, smell, taste, or touch. But to say that you're not experiencing anything in the dream is simply absurd. But you don't have to fall asleep to direct your attention to that domain of experience, which I'm simply going to call the space of the mind. It's a domain, a field, or space of experience that is non-sensory. And you have to be really seriously mentally impaired to deny that. And as I said, it's happened. You can direct your attention to it, and you can do it by a process of elimination. Often when I teach meditation, for people who don't really know what I'm talking about, I will simply say, direct your attention to the visual field. And now go auditory, and now go olfactory, and now go gustatory, and now go tactile, and now see what's left over. And in none of those 5 sense modalities do you pick up emotion, thoughts, mental imagery, desires, memories, fantasies. You don't pick up any mental events at all that are uniquely mental. And now redirect your attention away from those 5 fields, direct it to the leftover field, and we're going to call that the field of mind. And you can make that a meditative practice, and it can be quite extraordinary. So you can, and you do, and you may, direct your attention to the space of mental events, and there you may indeed, even though this is refuted, I think it is simply ignorantly refuted by people who don't have ability to do it. And that's because they've not trained. So what can we say? Some people may say it's impossible to ride a bike. Okay. You don't know how to ride a bike? Keep it to yourself. Observing whatever in that domain, observe whatever arises in that domain without distraction, without grasping. Mayang Zimen, it's called in Tibetan. It's the key instruction. Whatever comes up, if you're doing this meditative practice, it's not just daydreaming or going into free association and then having your mind unravel in all directions. In fact, you remain utterly poised, like a falcon, like a kestrel, that faces into the wind, remains motionless, and just modulates as the wind is coming over, but does not change location with respect to the ground. It hardly does. In the same way, you remain motionless in the space of the mind, even though you are buffeted by the winds of emotion, compulsive thoughts, memories, fantasies, desires, and there you remain poised, seeing them arise, seeing them pass, but you're not carried away by them. Carried away by them means you are no longer attending to the here and now, you are attending to the there and then, whatever the thought was about. You're thinking about when will the meditation session be over, what was for lunch, what will be for dinner, and on, and that ejects you, like the ejector seat in a jet. It ejects you out of the cockpit of your meditation session, of your meditation cushion, and you are there and then. And that's distraction. You've been carried away, you've been abducted. An alien abduction by this vagrant emergence in your mind. But it's not just distraction. It's also without grasping, which is actually much more subtle. If there is distraction, there is grasping. If there's grasping, there is not necessarily distraction. And that is, grasping is the latching onto the contents of the mind. Again, emotions, imagery, thoughts, whatever it may be. Latching onto them with preference, for example. I like it, please stay. I don't like it, please go. This is mine, stay, go. Any of this type of engagement where the mind, so to speak, is clenching its fists, latching onto, that's grasping. And it's very, very, very subtle. That is, it can be coarse, it can also be extraordinarily subtle. And the whole training in this program is of discipline is releasing the tentacles of distraction, and also more and more releasing the tentacles of grasping. In so doing, you can start to examine as you hover in this luminous, non-grasping space of awareness. You can start to examine the degree of subject-object participancy in this endeavor. I think there's a non-trivial analog here. Some people will argue that there can never be a science of introspection because, after all, even if what you're observing is not independent of the observer, even though it's not identical to it, even though it's so clunky to say the mind just observes the mind and that's all it. No, of course, you can observe mental events arising, thoughts, images, and so on like. But some will argue, even though what you're observing is not identical to the observer, nevertheless, this can't be scientific because what you're observing is not observer independent. And science must be objective. Science must observe things that are independent of the specific observer that are really out there. That's called objectivity. That's the scientific method. Observe things that are observer independent. Well, clearly your emotions, thoughts, and so forth are not observer independent, so therefore the reasoning goes, it's impossible to have a scientific introspective science of the mind. Well, this is nonsense. If this were true, then quantum mechanics is a great big belly flop. Because observer independence does not happen in quantum mechanics. The system of measurement is inextricably tied into that which you're measuring. The type of data you're going to glean depends upon the type of apparatus you set up. Do you want to observe waves? Do you want to observe particles? Set up your system, and then you will observe that which is somehow related to your system. But it's an open question in quantum mechanics whether an electron with a clear location and velocity actually even exists prior to and independent of the act of measurement. It's an unresolved question. So if observer participancy shatters the scientific integrity of a discipline, quantum mechanics, which is widely regarded as the most successful theory in the history of science, is a complete failure. Well, I'm going to say it's not a complete failure, that observer participancy is okay. And you can still deal with it, and it's just a different type of science. As that is true in quantum mechanics, I would argue it can be true here. There is clearly an observer participancy. But what becomes very interesting as you progress in this practice is that when you begin, it ever so often happens, I've taught this for years now, that beginning students will say, as soon as I observed such and such a mental event, it vanished. It was like trying to observe snowflakes with a magnifying glass with the sun over your shoulder. As soon as you get gone on contact. Tibetans in the Mahamudra tradition call this the bashful maiden. And then as soon as the young player, the ladies' man, brings his laser gaze to the woman, she vanishes because she's ever so bashful. She will not withstand his lusty gaze. That's very true. That is an experiential account of what it's like to do this practice in the beginning stages. But as you progress in it, you find, lo and behold, that the touch, metaphorically speaking, the touch of awareness gets softer and lighter and lighter. And you can start to observe events taking place as if you were merely overhearing them or witnessing them that happen to be in a space in which you happen to be present, but not clearly having a sense that they were really yours. Anything that appears in the space of your mind, I would argue, is not necessarily yours in any substantial fashion. It may not be anybody else's. But the mere fact that something arises in the space of your awareness, why does it make it yours? I am arising in the space of your awareness. Have I therefore become your slave? Sounds appear in the field of your awareness. Are they therefore your sounds? If thoughts or images arise in the space of your awareness, what makes you so sure that they're yours? Why are they not simply events arising in dependence upon prior causes and conditions? So this is not a dogma, it is a question. Examine the degree of subject-object participancy. Examine the extent to which thoughts and emotions are experienced as being actually yours. And I would say that is a very low issue. We can go a little bit further. Mahasiddhamaitrika, one of the great Indian adepts, gives another technique which is not the same as, but is related to the earlier. Another technique of not trying to probe the very nature of consciousness itself. Not so interested in the nature of mental events arising, passing, that kind of thing, but just what's the fundamental nature of consciousness? And you kind of clean off all the barnacles, the aggregations, the overlays, the formations of consciousness, and get down to the ground. Here's a technique he gives. Vacantly direct your gaze into the intervening vacuity, just in the space in front of you. See that the three conceptualization types of thoughts of the past, present, and future, as well as wholesome, unwholesome, and ethically neutral thoughts, together with all the causes, assembly, and dispersal of thoughts in the three times, are completely cut off. In other words, create a mental vacuum. Physicists are very good at doing this, at creating a volume and then sucking everything out they possibly can. And out of that they get a relative vacuum state. And they're enormously useful. I've asked some physicist friends of mine, what are vacuums good for? And the list goes on and on and on and on. Incredible. Television. What you got? And it's only possible because you have vacuum. So the boob tube really is out. Well, what you're doing here is something analogous. You are creating a vacuum state of consciousness by extricating from it, or damping out, or removing all possible content. Thoughts containing past, present, and future, together with everything that goes with them, all the clutter, all the contents of the mind. Bring no thoughts to mind. Let the mind, like a cloudless sky, be empty, clear, and evenly devoid of grasping, and settled in utter vacuity. It will be like being deep asleep with your physical senses utterly withdrawn, your cognitive abilities, that is conceptualization and so forth, going flat, and being luminously awake. In other words, lucid, dreamless sleep. That's a preview, that's a sneak preview to this rather advanced state of meditation. By so doing, there arises the quiescence or calm abiding, which is characterized by these three qualities. Which I think is, this discovery right here, I think, is one of the greatest discoveries made in the scientific study of the mind. And it's not just a Buddhist thing, it's anybody who does this practice well discovers these are the three qualities that leap forward. Bliss. That empty, luminous space is of the nature of bliss. And it's not because you're looking at something blissful, it's right in the nature of awareness itself. Clarity or luminosity is not something you add on, it's right there in the nature of awareness, and then non-conceptuality is the mind in its rest state. So to my mind, this is an utterly fascinating area of inquiry. Subjective experience, the nature of the mind, mental phenomena, nature of consciousness. I mean, what could be more fascinating and more crucial to our very existence here for self-understanding, finding a happiness in life? So why is it that subjective experience has been so marginalized? Why is it that from the time of Copernicus it was 300 years before an experimental science of the mind even began? Right within a couple of years of Lord Kelvin saying physics is pretty much finished, advising his students, don't go into the field of physics, we're finished. That was just before Max Planck and Einstein. But why would they have that confidence? One could say arrogance, but let's be more gentle. How could they have that extraordinary confidence? They basically had nature figured out without even starting a science of the mind. And why would contemporary neurologists, neuroscientists like Antonio Damasio make the claim, which I can almost quote verbatim, saying that, acknowledging first of all we don't understand the nature of consciousness, but he says, and it's a very close paraphrase, when we do, it will have little or no significance for our understanding of reality as a whole. We don't know it, but when we do, it won't matter. How did subjective experience get so trivialized, so marginalized, that behaviorists could for 50 years say it doesn't exist and people didn't burst into hilarious laughter? How could that happen? And I think there are reasons, and I think William James has put his finger right on it. In this marvelous quote, he said the subjects, the objects, the phenomena adhere to become real subjects. The attributes adhere to real attributes. The existence adhere to real existence. While the subjects disregarded become imaginary subjects. The attributes disregarded, erroneous attributes, and the existence disregarded, an existence in no man's land, in the limbo where footless fancies dwell. Habitually and practically, we do not count these disregarded things as existence at all. They are not even treated as appearances, they are treated as if they were mere waste, equivalent to nothing at all. That is exactly the diagnosis of behaviorism, culminating in V.F. Skinner. Subjective experience doesn't exist. It's not even an appearance. Or there are contemporary philosophers of mind like Patricia and Paul Churchland, the eliminative materialists that will tell you, and they write it in many essays and books, that all subjective experience consists only of illusions. It doesn't exist at all. All that exists is brain function. And we should actually ideally do away with subjective terminology like belief, feel, think, feel, these kind of things. We should talk about hippocampus, amygdala, 4D hertz this, prefrontal cortex that, and that's how we should say, I love you. My left prefrontal cortex is highly activated with a boost from the amygdala, or something like that. And you say, oh, gee, me too. So this is a marginalization that continues in neuroscience very big time, and it was very dominant throughout the whole history of behaviorism. But it's dominant in the history of Western science. The fact that we could overlook the scientific study of the mind for 300 years is astonishing when we consider that the mind is your primary instrument for making any observation of whatsoever. Whoops, can't skip Richard Feynman. We need to be skeptical here. If there's going to be a science of the mind, it's got to be skeptical. Otherwise, it's just religion, it's just philosophy, but it's not science. Richard Feynman has raised the bar very, very high here. And I love this quote. I will read it with great admiration. One of the ways of stopping science would be only to do experiments in the region where you know the law. But experimenters, he's talking about the really, really good ones. Experimenters search most diligently and with the greatest effort in exactly those places where it seems most likely that we can prove our theories wrong. In other words, we're trying to prove ourselves wrong as quickly as possible because only in that way can we find progress. In my many happy engagement with scientists, I find the ones, broadly speaking, this is an enormous generalization, the ones with the greatest confidence tend to be in the physical sciences, willing to consider all kinds of really oddball ideas, multiple universes, all kinds of weird stuff. They have a lot of confidence. They are what the other scientists are trying to emulate. Physics was a success. Everybody's a success insofar as it's like physics. When you get to the cognitive sciences, how often does this happen? What would blow apart the fundamental assumptions underlying modern cognitive science, such as the mind is nothing more than a function of the brain? What would blow that great big fat assumption out of the water? Compelling evidence for extrasensory perception would do it. That would be a fatal blow. Ian Stevenson's work, if it were pursued and done more and more rigorously by multiple researchers into past lives, empirical evidence, not religious faith, if that were done over and over again by multiple researchers, that would blow the materialistic hypothesis out of the water forever. It would be wound up, it would go into the realm of phlogiston and caloric. It's an antiquated, silly old notion. Near-death experiences. We'd have Harvard and MIT and Caltech and so forth, pouring millions and millions of dollars into studying near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences. And of course, there would be tens of millions of dollars going into research on refining attention, because refinement of attention is said to be the key in Buddhism and other traditions for developing extrasensory perception, past life recall, precognition, and on and on and on to go. So we know how many tens of millions of dollars have been spent on exploring refinement of attention. Maybe in some future world. But that, of course, is fallen through the cracks. And people who do devote their lives to parapsychology are really pariahs. I try to get a job here and saying, I want to apply for a tenure position here, and I'm really interested in parapsychology and extrasensory perception. Here's my resume. I think you've just shafted yourself. And so, unfortunately, in this rather tentative field of cognitive science, which doesn't yet have one revolution, that's done very rarely. I think they're too afraid. That's my guess. Is skepticism confined to science, or can we find any indication of it in Buddhism? A very famous quote, ever so often cited, attributed to the Buddha. Monks, just as the wise accept gold after testing it by heating, cutting, and rubbing it, so are my words to be accepted after examining them, but not out of respect for me. This is very unusual to regard him as a religious teacher. Oh, ye of little faith, is what we hear from Jesus. And I say that without any disparagement, but this is a faith-based tradition. Abraham, Moses, Isaac, and so forth, the prophets, they're not saying, this might have come from God, you better check it out. Never them say. Or Muhammad, saying, be very critical of what I'm about to say, because, I could be dead wrong here. This could be a result of epileptic seizures, so you might want to check it out. I don't think that was there. And so this is not known by religious leaders. They don't encourage skepticism and calling upon investigation, empirical inquiry, rational inquiry. The Buddha did. And it's not just that one quote. And we find it didn't die out with the Buddha. Here's a statement from the Dalai Lama, which This is certainly not echoed by all Buddhists, and there are a lot of dogmatic Buddhists nowadays, but Dalai Lama is not one of them. And here's a statement from him quite recently. A general basic stance of Buddhism is that it is inappropriate to hold a view that is logically inconsistent. This is taboo. But even more taboo than holding a view that is logically inconsistent is holding a view that goes against direct experience. So he said numerous times, if the scientists do come up with some compelling empirical data that shows that reincarnation is just false, he said, I'll throw it out. Just as he's already jettisoned various elements of Buddhist cosmology, Mount Meru, the 4 continents, and so forth and so on. He said, the astronauts didn't see it. And so if it was there for us to see, well, it's not there, so therefore we're going to throw that one out, and we survived. Buddhism didn't fall apart, it seems. And so there is an ideal. Not all Buddhists endorse that, but I think we can see that he is really reflecting an older view. So from my own perspective, I'm quoting here Daniel Worsten, an accomplished historian from an excellent book called The Discoverers. He makes this comment in the preface, which I think has enormous import. He says, illusions of knowledge, the sense of knowing something that you don't actually know. You've only made a great big fat assumption, but you don't think it's assumption, you think you know it. Such as the statement I've read countless times, the brain alone is solely responsible for the production of all mental states. And then you turn around to the same person who said that and say, do you know that necessary and sufficient causes of consciousness? No. In the next paragraph, they'll say all over again, the brain alone is totally, and it's really a weird kind of thing. Not knowing what the necessary and sufficient causes are, and yet nevertheless insisting, the brain alone, there are no non-physical influences in the brain. Cannot possibly be. We know them. They don't know that at all. But they think they do, and that seems to be as good. This is an illusion of knowledge, he says. Illusions of knowledge and not ignorance have historically proven to be the principal obstacles to discovery. It's just fine to be ignorant. It's very fertile ground. But to be ignorant and think you're knowledgeable, that's a real problem. It's a problem in Buddhism, where people think they have realizations they don't have. It's a problem in science, where people think they have knowledge, which in fact are simply assumptions. So I think we are in a position poised historically now to finally complete William James's vision that he presented to us over 100 years ago of a threefold strategy of studying the mind, neural, behavioral, and introspective. To complete that, contemplative and scientific inquiry may be integrated in a complementary fashion. And I do mean that Buddhism by itself, at least in terms of the literature, doesn't tell us anything about the brain. I mean, really nothing. There is no Buddhist theory of the brain. So if introspection reveals the nature of the brain, functioning of neurons, synapses, and various parts of the brain and so forth, well, you certainly don't find it in the texts. That's what I would say as a scholar. It's not there. The Buddhists don't have a theory of the brain, and the brain is very important for the mind. So you want to study that. And the West is very good. The West is very good at experimental, quantitative study of behavior. Buddhism does qualitative, but not quantitative study of behavior. So there's complementarity there. And really the gist of it is moving towards the synthesis of rigorous first and third person means of investigating the mind. This may lead to a long-awaited revolution in the cognitive sciences. I argue again, as I said earlier, we haven't had one. I think there are good reasons we've not had one, and that is we have not developed sophisticated means of observing the phenomena themselves, any more than the astrologers do. Very good at correlates, really poor at professionally observing the phenomena. Galileo started. William James moved us in the right direction. Maybe it's time now, 100 years later, to pick up where he left off. And that may lead to actually the first revolution in the cognitive sciences. And my wonderment here is whether such a revolution, if that really took place, and I'm not going to pretend to know what it would be like, I'm just saying we haven't done it yet, and this might lead to it, of an unprecedented integration or collaboration of the third-person methodologies of what modern science and the first-person methodology of Buddhism and other contemplative traditions. They have never been brought together before, and it's just beginning now. If such a revolution could take place, I think it's at least a feasible hypothesis that such a revolution may have implications that could help bring to culmination the second revolution in the physical science. Problem of measurement, problem of observer participation. Is the role of the mind in any way significant in the field of quantum mechanics? People like Henry Stapp out at Berkeley believe it is. Eugene Whitner, John von Neumann, two of the very brilliant minds in the latter part of the 20th century in physics, thought that consciousness was really integral to that process. But we frankly don't know enough about consciousness to do much with their theories. Because consciousness is like a black box. It's a word, and then we only have folk psychology to fill in the reckoning of that word. So, maybe we can do better. That's it.